Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Ritula Shah. This is, well, it's the World Tonight and it's the World Service. So I'm feeling a little bit schizophrenic today. I've got two hats on, which is what you're going to have to imagine. I'm going to talk in a moment, but first of all, I'm going to hand over to our host just to introduce the event, as it were, Luiz, Augusto, Castro, Neves.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank BBC for this opportunity and this partnership, and also the ESPM for the space it has so graciously offered to us. Today's theme is Brazil's global role, losing momentum. That's a question. I must perhaps try to mention the fact that Brazil has been always a very inward-looking country. International relations and even Brazilian foreign policy is not a very important issue in our agenda, in any government's agenda, even in the Brazilian society. International relations has always received somehow low priority in a number of problems that affect Brazil: inflation, employment, urban infrastructure, and there are many items in the Brazilian agenda which are much more important or considered by the population, by the Brazilian society, to be much more important than international relations. Brazil's foreign policy, as far as its substance is concerned, hasn't changed much over the last, I would say, half-century. What has changed is the rhetoric of that foreign policy. Mainly after, in the beginning of this century, when the Workers' Party came to power, there was a sort of a rhetorical activism in our foreign policy, which was not always matched by realities. And in this respect, sometimes it conveys an exaggerated message. I do remember The Economist a few years ago had in its cover story was Brazil taking off, and the Christ the Redeemer was beginning to fly. It was some sort of like a rocket. Well, it was an exaggeration at the time. At the time, I even have the feeling that it would be a sort of a publicity or propaganda of the government that they had bought The Economist for that.
You do realise you're breaking one of my rules, you know. You're discussing what we're going to discuss before we've even begun.
All right, but it is a fact. I'm not bringing other persons and other issues in our debate. But the fact is that a few years later, they had to backtrack in their previous analysis and present an exaggeration in the other direction. But the average is perhaps more correct. Well, this is perhaps a good background information to be brought about, because one must qualify the Brazil's global role as much more of a rhetorical position on the part of a number of people, and it does not permeate the rest of the Brazilian society. Most of the Brazilian population could care less whether Brazil is or will be or not a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. As a matter of fact, in terms of substantial position, Brazil has consistently evaded defining itself in a number of important problems, such as the Ukraine problem recently.
Right, now you really are straying onto my territory. Move the tank. Come on.
It's perhaps your inspiration. Even in our Mercosur, there was a dispute between Uruguay and Argentina about a paper mill that would be close to the border of both countries. And in a way, they wanted Brazil to sort of mediate the matter, and we simply washed our hands. It's a bilateral problem. I have nothing to do with that, regardless of the fact that we represent 2/3 of the Mercosur economy, and obviously for size reasons, we should exercise the leadership of the bloc. But that is just a background introduction.
Right, I am going to stop you now because I definitely want to talk about some of these things in a minute. Right. So let me talk. I've been very rude. I've interrupted you several times. British radio and television presenters have a terrible reputation for interrupting, and I think I've proven my point. So I apologise, but it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for having us. I'm going to begin by explaining. We're going to do a bit of housework, as it were. So I don't know how many of you listen to BBC Radio, to the World Service, or to Radio 4. So Radio 4 is where we work. The World Tonight is a daily news programme. It goes out Monday to Friday at 10 o'clock in the evening. It's 45 minutes, and most of the focus is on international affairs, but we do obviously do some domestic news. So we're recording this. This will go out as an entire programme tomorrow evening, but it will also go out on the World Service, which many of you may have heard, which is obviously the BBC's sort of international facing arm. So what you're going to see today is obviously you're going to hear this debate, which I think will be fantastic, but you'll also sort of see the seams of a radio programme. Imagine that you have a garment that sort of looks beautiful from the outside, a jacket or something, and if you turn it out inside out, you can see kind of where it's been sewn, where the darts have been put in and all the rest of it. Well, you're kind of going to see that. You'll see how it works. So the easiest way to explain is the way the programme would normally begin at 10 o'clock at night is that we have these things called the pips. So as you come up to the hour, there's this sound. We can't make the sound, can we, Lee? No, all right, I'm going to have to improvise. The sound goes something like boop, 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 and a red light goes on in front of me there, and I kind of jump into action like some kind of Pavlovian dog. So clearly we don't have the red light. We have me doing a very bad impression of the pips. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to read lots of tops, as it were. So you'll hear the top of what would be the World Tonight, the top of what will be the World Service programme, and various idents. So bear with me for a minute, well, several minutes actually, but about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll get into the debate proper. But this is, as I say, you're sort of seeing the seams of the garment, I think is the way. So, Lee, I'm going to start by doing the World Tonight top, first of all. It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. This is a special edition of the World Tonight from Rio de Janeiro. I'm Ritula Shah, and tonight I'm going to be discussing Brazil in 2014. This is a landmark year for the world's 7th largest economy. This week, Brazil marks the 50th anniversary of a coup and the start of 21 years of military rule. In June, Brazil will host the World Cup, and later this year there are presidential elections in which the incumbent, Dilma Rousseff, will fight for a second term in office. But is this also the moment when we see a confident new power take to the world stage? Or are there signs of a retreat from a nation which has decided to focus on itself? Is Brazil willing to fight for a place at the global top table? Does it want to lead the nations of South America? And does it see itself as part of the West, or is it firmly non-aligned? That's all up for discussion with a panel of distinguished guests here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, recorded in Rio. But first, the BBC News. And at that point, there would be a 7-minute news bulletin, which there isn't today. I'm going to do a quick ident. This is a special edition of The World Tonight from the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio. I'm Ritula Shah. And then I'm going to do the World Service top. Could you time it, though? Or I've taken your phone. It needs to be 59 seconds or a little bit less. Tell me when to go. Welcome to Rio de Janeiro for this special debate from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah, and in a landmark year... I have to do that again, sorry. Welcome to Rio de Janeiro for this special debate from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah, and in a landmark year for this country, I'm going to be discussing Brazil in 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. This week, Brazil marks the 50th anniversary of a coup, which was followed by 21 years of military rule. In June, Brazil will host the World Cup, and later this year there are presidential elections in which the incumbent, Dilma Rousseff, will fight for a second term in office. But is this also the moment when we see a new power on the international stage, or are there signs of a retreat from a nation which would rather focus on itself? Is the world's 7th largest economy also the natural leader of South America? That's all up for discussion with a panel of distinguished guests here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio. But first, the BBC News. A bit short, okay. Oh, that's far too short. Okay, do it slower. I'm going to time it. That will be better for me. Welcome to Rio de Janeiro for this special debate from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah, and in a landmark year for this country, I'm going to be discussing Brazil in 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. This week, Brazil marks the 50th anniversary of a coup, which was followed by 21 years of military rule. In June, Brazil will host the World Cup, and later this year there are presidential elections, in which the incumbent, Dilma Rousseff, will fight for a second term in office. But is this also the moment when we see a new power on the international stage, or are there signs of a retreat from a nation which would rather focus on itself? Is the world's seventh largest economy also the natural leader of South America? That's all up for discussion with a panel of distinguished guests here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio. But first, it's the BBC News. Yeah, I think we can manage with that. Okay, there's one more, which needs to be 30 seconds. Right. Welcome to Rio de Janeiro for this special debate from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah, and I'm discussing Brazil in 2014, emerging as a global power or retreating from the world stage. From the 50th anniversary of a military coup to hosting the World Cup, it's an important year for Brazil. But is the world's seventh largest economy willing to fight for more power and influence on the global stage? I'll be discussing all that here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio. But first, the BBC News. Okay, and there's two more. I promise you, I've nearly finished. This is terribly dull. Even I find it terribly, terribly dull. Let me stop that. Reset. This is a special BBC debate from Rio de Janeiro. Brazil in 2014, emerging as a global power or retreating from the world stage. This is a special debate from the BBC World Service. This is a special debate from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah, and we're discussing Brazil in 2014. Is the world's seventh largest economy taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage? Okay, that's done. Brilliant. All right, we're nearly there. Yes?
Don't we not, maybe imagine, don't we need one that gets into the summary and
I've got that in the script. I'll do that, as it were, as we go along. Yes, we do, though. You're absolutely right. I'm now going to do a false start, which will be the World Service top, and then I'll do the proper start, but I'll stop. Okay, we're nearly there, guys. It's about 20 seconds away now. So the news has finished. On the world tonight, it lasts for 6.5 minutes. So at about 7 minutes past, I start looking at my clock and getting antsy, and I look at the newsreader, and the newsreader kind of gives me the nod to say he's nearly finished or she's nearly finished. So the newsreader's finished. Good evening and welcome to this special BBC World Service debate. Good evening and welcome to this special BBC World Service debate from Rio de Janeiro. I'm Ritula Shah. Do stay with me. Oh, no, this is wrong cue. Sorry. Sorry. Good evening and welcome to this special BBC... Oh, I don't need a good evening, do I? Because we don't know what time it goes out. I've just realised. Welcome.
It goes out around the middle of the afternoon and what's up.
Yeah, okay. Welcome to this special BBC World Service debate from Rio de Janeiro. I'm Ritula Shah and we're discussing Brazil 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. Our host is CEBRI. Right, now we really are going to start. This is it, guys. Good evening and welcome to this special edition of The World Tonight, recorded in Rio de Janeiro. I'm Ritula Shah and our host tonight is CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations, a think tank set up to discuss this country and its relationship with the rest of the world. We're joined by a distinguished panel who I'll introduce to you in a moment. But first, let's take a moment to look at where Brazil is now. 2014 is an important year. This week marks the 50th anniversary of a coup which ousted a leftist president and ushered in 21 years of military rule. Democracy resumed in 1985, and in a few months' time, there'll be presidential elections, with the incumbent Dilma Rousseff standing for a second term. And in mid-June, the world's attention will be here because Brazil is, of course, hosting the World Cup. But last year, public concern about the cost of holding the tournament burst onto the streets. sometimes violently. People chanted, "We want world-class hospitals and schools, as well as world-class stadiums." So will the tournament be quite the moment on the global stage Brazil had hoped for? This is Rio de Janeiro's world-famous Maracanã Stadium. There's a game about to kick off today. You can probably hear the fans heading in behind me. Originally, it was built for the last time Brazil hosted the World Cup. That was back in 1950, when almost 200,000 people watched Brazil lose to Uruguay in the final. The Maracanã has been spruced up at a cost of some £320 million to prepare for this year's tournament. But spending like that and much, much more for the stadiums built from scratch elsewhere in the country has angered large sections of the Brazilian public, as the massive demonstrations which gripped the country last summer showed. The national mood has changed since Brazil won the right to host the World Cup back in 2007. At the time, the economy was booming, and the then president, Lula da Silva, saw it as an opportunity for Brazil, the new economic powerhouse, to take its rightful place on the international stage. The reality, 7 years later, may be rather less glorious, according to Professor Rafael Alcalgipani of the FGV think tank and business school.
Do we really need it to have this type of tournament in a country so unequal as that? The stadiums were good in a way because the population were able to realize how we waste public money in this country. The FIFA World Cup is not a World Cup for the Brazilian population. The FIFA World Cup is a World Cup for the corporations that sponsor FIFA. They have most of the seats. They have a lot of says in terms of how things are going to take place inside the stadiums. So the regular Brazilian, the Brazilian on the streets who would love to watch the Brazilian match, to see the Brazil playing inside Brazil, they will not be able to do it because the tickets are really very expensive. Which is a totally different situation in the 1950s when there wasn't this globalization. Now the typical Brazilian is outside the stadiums.
Do we know how much the World Cup has cost then?
One of the worst estimates says that the Brazilian World Cup is more expensive than all other World Cups together. When Brazil got the World Cup, it was like the golden times of Lula government. Now we are seeing the Lula model of development for Brazil fade in a way, and the World Cup becomes also a sign of this, in my point of view.
So economically then, what will the World Cup mean for Brazil? Will it have any long-term consequences?
Well, I think it will create a big debt for the Brazilian government and for the Brazilians to play. That's the story of big events all over the world. But the particular case of Brazil, as you don't see those stadiums being used after the World Cup, we are going to have white elephants, 3 or 4 big white elephants that's going to last for nothing. The building work for infrastructure of Brazil, that usually this can be something, a legacy for the World Cup, didn't happen in Brazil. So I don't see for the future of Brazil, anything positive more than that for the World Cup.
Rafael Alcalgipani with a rather negative view there, which we can discuss with our panel. Let me introduce you to them. Luiz Augusto Castro e Neves is a former Brazilian ambassador to China and a senior foreign ministry official and president of our host, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. Kjeld Jakobsen is a foreign affairs spokesman for the governing PT, or Workers' Party. Paulo Wrobel is an economist from the BRICS Institute, which is a think tank here in Rio. And Samantha Person is a correspondent for the Financial Times in Brazil. Welcome to you all. Luiz Augusto Castro e Neves, if I can begin with you. Has the World Cup, do you think, revealed the weaknesses in Brazil's economy and its governance?
No, I think that the World Cup has revealed how precarious is our infrastructure. In today's mega events such as this one does require a lot of investment in infrastructures, in airports, in highways, and stadiums, and accommodation for all those who are coming here, not only the athletes, but also tourists, and the number of visitors which will come to Brazil will increase quite a lot. I was in China when they were preparing the Olympics, and I left China just after the Olympics, and I saw the huge investment they made in a single city, because the Olympics would take place in Beijing only. The Olympics take place in just one city. It's not the case of the World Cup, which will, in Brazil, will take place in 12 states and 12 cities. So the requirements are much more difficult to fulfill than the Olympics. I think that this is what what we have, the World Cup and any other mega event will make it much more explicit how precarious Brazil's infrastructure is.
Samantha Person, do you think this is the kind of debut onto the international stage that President Lula, who of course was in charge when Brazil won the right to host the World Cup, that he imagined?
Exactly, it's completely not what he imagined. I think when Brazil won the bid to host the World Cup in 2007, it was a great moment for Brazil, and I think he benefited from that hugely politically. But I think if he could have imagined what it would turn out like and what we're seeing nowadays, he probably wouldn't have bid for it in the first place. We're seeing that it's become, it's showing Brazil's problems to the world, not only infrastructure, but also social problems. You mentioned the protests that we saw last year. And a lot of people in Brazil have that opinion, you know, how can you spend this much money on the World Cup when we have such terrible health services, public health services, education services. But in some ways, I think the World Cup bid is important, and perhaps Brazil's government is not doing a good enough job of communicating that to the rest of the world. For example, Brazil took the decision to part privatize many of its airports. And that was a huge deal for Brazil, you know, which is run by a traditionally socialist government, and it's something they probably would have never done, and it's something that needs to be done. So in many ways, that is progress, in my opinion.
Paulo Wrobel, we're heading in a slightly more positive direction now. Do you think the World Cup has some positive aspects to it for Brazil?
Oh, of course it does. It does. It will show somehow, if it is most probably successful, it will show the Brazilian capacity of organizing a big sporting event. But I will just mention that this sort of organization of big sporting events, I think they are becoming a process in itself. They are becoming more important than the country themselves. I think FIFA and the sporting Olympics organization are becoming such a powerful organizations that they are somehow setting the agenda of the sporting events much more the interests of the population of the countries, or even the big supporters of football or the Olympics.
Kjeld Jakobsen, it's always a gamble, isn't it, hosting one of these events? It will be a fantastic party, but politically, is it quite dangerous to find yourself with protesters on the streets and people complaining about how much the cup is costing to stage and so on?
Well, obviously that's a challenge. This argument has been raised, but I also think that we should look to the benefits coming out from these events. The attention to the country, the prestige that the country gets, the infrastructure that has to be attended, as mentioned before, which is something that will remain for a long time. And the stadiums here will not at all become white elephants, because Brazil is a country that loves soccer, and they will be used afterwards.
You think even the ones where there's no big local football team will be used?
Sure, absolutely. I can assure you that the new one, which is being constructed in São Paulo and belongs to the team that I support, Corinthians, will quite well
That's a particularly good one, isn't it?
It will be quite used, you can be sure.
Vested interest.
Let's talk about then the meat and drink of why we're here. Under President Lula, Kjeld Jakobsen, Brazil was regarded as very active on the foreign stage. The accusation that's sometimes raised against President Dilma is that now it's one of retreat. Would you accept that thesis?
Not at all. The amazing thing is that those who are criticizing the present external policy, comparing it with the President Lula's policy, were the same people who criticized his policy at that time. So it has to do with the coming elections. The issue is that the Dilma's government has to consolidate what Lula started, the relationships, the creation of international coalitions, and so forth. So then it obviously creates a perception that many things are not being done at the present. It's also not fair to compare what was done in 80 years and what is being done during just 3 years. And the styles of the presidents are obviously also different.
Luiz, Augusto, Castro, Neves, do you see a retreat going on as someone who's been inside the diplomatic service for many years?
I wouldn't call it a retreat. As a matter of fact, President Lula was very fond of foreign policy. He liked to travel, he liked to say things, to meet other heads of state. President Dilma apparently doesn't like and doesn't understand, has no patience at all for the liturgies of international relations. So therefore, she doesn't want to be bothered very much by foreign policy problems. It's a sort of a heavy burden for her. I mentioned that before, that we are absent in a number of decisions which would be important for us. For instance, let's give you an example. We are the second most important country in the Organization of American States, the OAS. First one, of course, is the United States. We have brought the question of human rights to the OAS in a number of times before. Now the OAS wanted to alleging human rights, wanted to interfere in the construction of a hydroelectric power plant, the Belo Monte, and we were very angry at that. We withdrew our ambassador there, have been without representation in the OAS for more than 2 years, which in a way it demonstrates the lack of priority that the President herself attributes to this important issue. As a matter of fact, she's not willing to become involved and entangled by those problems of foreign policy problems.
Samantha Person, how would you view this as a journalist covering everyday events, in a sense? Ukraine is something, a discussion from which Brazil has been absent. Should it have been there? Did it really have a dog in that particular fight?
Yeah, I think we have seen a clear retreat from Lula. I think even if you look at the number of foreign trips that their presidents took, I think I'm stealing BBC data here as well. Dilma, in her first 3 years of government, she travelled to 31 countries. In the first 3 years of Lula's second mandate, he travelled to 59 countries. So I think it's clear that Dilma doesn't like foreign policy as much as Lula did. Lula liked being in the spotlight, and I think that was a big part of it. So in visible terms, I think we've seen a retreat, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a bad thing for Brazil, particularly because Dilma, I think she has tried very hard to improve the relationship with the US, which was damaged particularly under Lula's government. And given that the US is Brazil's second biggest trading partner, that's, I think, a really important step for Brazil.
Paulo Wrobel, the idea of the BRICS Institute is one that has come out of the formation of the BRICS as an organisation, as a grouping, something that President Lula was very keen on. How do you view all this from within your institute?
Well, I think the formation of the BRICS was, and it is, a good opportunity for now the five countries. Originally, they were chosen, so to speak, because they were big, important markets, and they had a potential role to fill in global affairs. This is why they were selected as these 4 countries. Then South Africa was added. It's a much smaller country, but now it's part of the BRICS. And it's an organization which is evolving. It's not a formal organization. It's a collection somehow of these 5 countries which meet once a year.
But is it an opportunity for Brazil, in a sense, to expand its role on the
It is an opportunity for the 5 countries to play a bigger role together with the other 4 countries. I think we are in a moment. There is a sort of a power vacuum in the world. The US is certainly in a sort of global retreat. The US under Obama is clearly not the US under President Bush, former President Bush. And of course, what we are seeing now is another country, another former Cold War, big powers such as Russia, being more active internationally because there is this power vacuum. Somehow, I think Brazil is not feeling its potential, and it is, in a way, in a retreat.
Kjeld Jakobsen, in that sense, then, is Brazil missing a trick? The 7th largest economy, with a big economy, do there come greater responsibilities on the international stage?
Sure. Well, this month we are going to hold an international conference on the regulation of the internet, which is something that came out after the denouncement that President Dilma made on the American surveillance on her own phone calls, on Petrobras, all those issues that we have heard so much about. She refused to visit, to pay the official visit to the U.S. as a response, a very strong and adequate response, in my opinion. And recently we approved in the Brazilian parliament such a regulation which could eventually become a base for the discussions this month on an issue which is absolutely necessary and a Brazilian initiative.
So you see this as being something where Brazil is taking a lead globally?
Of course, particularly on this issue.
Okay, I want to move on to look at that specifically at the relationship with the United States. Brazil has a reputation, I think it's fair to say, for a certain independence in foreign policy. It eventually joined the Allied side in World War II, sending troops to fight in Italy. And as a former Portuguese colony with historical ties to Europe, the US definitely sees it as part of the Western Bloc. But is that how Brazil sees itself? The country often doesn't follow the US lead, something which leaves Washington rather perplexed, as Beth McLeod now reports.
The pomp and ceremony of a state dinner at the White House. The tuxedos, the ball gowns, the two flags waving side by side. Brazil's president was the only world leader invited last year. But following revelations in September that the US had been spying on Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff postponed the visit indefinitely.
Brazil had placed great hopes in the state visit.
Paulo Sotero is the director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Yes, this is a moment of challenge, of difficulty in Brazil-US relations, but I think the interest of both countries remain more convergent than they are divergent. There is not a major discussion on global affairs, be it on climate change, food security, on economic stability, that can happen without Brazil playing a role. A lot of people in the United States, in the policymaking community, understand this. I think Americans are welcoming of Brazilians. Americans see in Brazil a democracy, the rising middle class that wants more, wants better, wants faster. Americans relate to that.
There have, though, been times when Brazil's actions on the global stage have confused and even angered the US government. And when trouble strikes in its own backyard, like the ongoing unrest in Venezuela, the US doesn't always see Brazil as a reliable regional partner, according to Michael Shifter, the president of the Inter-American Dialogue.
I think the United States is perplexed by Brazilian foreign policy, perplexed by Brazil's position regarding the crisis in Venezuela. Brazil is the largest democracy in South America and takes pride in its democratic performance and its record, and yet it seems to be really unwilling to take a stand or to become involved in the situation in Venezuela, a situation that could get a lot worse.
What role would the US like to see Brazil play in the global order?
Well, the United States would, I think, would want to see Brazil play a role that's probably not prepared to play, because there is this tendency for the United States to say, well, Brazil is in the Western Hemisphere, they're a big democracy, we should be partners, but not really respecting that Brazil has a very different approach to lots of issues. And that's why I see a lot of policy officials frustrated by Brazil, because they just don't fully understand that Brazil is an independent power, and it's precisely its independence from the United States that accounts for its rise.
The Apple Store in Washington is always busy with foreign visitors eager to pick up a bargain. And Brazilian tourists are flocking to the US with empty suitcases in order to shop. Between them, they spent over $9 billion in 2012. Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of the Americas, says that trade more broadly between the US and Brazil is increasing, but still has a way to go.
Brazil is really important, but not as important at this point as certainly our immediate neighbors like Canada or Mexico, or even some more distant trade partners like China, Japan, Eastern European Union, etc.
The relationship between the US and Brazil has had a bit of a rocky patch recently. How have US businesses seen that? Has that been frustrating for them?
It's been very frustrating for them. The U.S. business really sees a lot of potential in Brazil, the large market. There are also some complicating things in Brazil in terms of doing business, the tax code and infrastructure and things like this. But one of the untold stories in the Brazil-U.S. relationship is actually Brazilian investment in the United States, which is increasing very dramatically over the last couple of years and will continue to do so. So the relationship is too important that the businesses are not going to just walk away. They're going to continue to operate very effectively with each other.
After a difficult period for the US and Brazil, things do seem to be improving. The Treasury Secretary Jack Lew recently went to Brasilia, a sign that the US does want to start repairing relations with a country it sees as a potentially very important partner, albeit one whose independent perspective it sometimes finds frustrating.
Beth McLeod reporting. Paulo Wrobel, where does Brazil stand? Does it belong to the West? Should its loyalties lie with the United States?
No, of course it does belong to the West. And as a big country, as a country which, as every country tries to defend its interests, its own interests, there are challenges, there are problems, there are difficulties with the US, but it's a long and important relationship to Brazil, of course. And it should be maintained as an important relationship. One of the problems that I see is that there is a sort of ambiguity in Brazil towards the United States. This is not new, but it's becoming more so. And there is an ambiguity in this sense. Should Brazil become closer to the United States economically and politically? Should Brazil become more independent? Is it a sign of being independent from the United States? This relationship is very complex, and this ambiguity is really part of the game.
Kjeld Jakobsen, should it become closer?
Brazil belongs to the world. I think that this concept of East and West is a Cold War concept and should not be used anymore.
Some might say the Cold War is back.
Huh?
Some might say the Cold War is back.
Well, there are people, maybe people desiring that, but we disagree totally about this.
Do you see Brazil as non-aligned then?
Well, Brazil is autonomous, sovereign country, has relationships with all those who want to have relationships with us, which includes the US, which includes China, which includes Africa, our neighbor countries. So it doesn't make sense that we should align with here and there. And therefore, we are part of several coalitions like the BRICS.
Actually, I'm going to stop you because that phone went off. I'm sorry. Okay. I will ask you the question again. I forgot to say that you should switch them off. But anyway, can everybody switch their phones off? So let me ask you the question again. So okay. Where does Brazil stand? Yeah, go on. Just take as much as you want.
All right. No, in my opinion, Brazil belongs to the world, and to use the concept of East and West, that's a Cold War concept. And I don't think that we want to return to that period, despite it seems that some people wish to. And therefore, the relationships with Brazil is with all those countries who want to have relations with us, which includes the US, China, Europe, our neighbor countries, Africa, and so forth. We are part of several coalitions in order to strengthen positions on certain issues and on other issues.
I want to bring up the specific question of Venezuela, Luiz, Augusto, Castro, and Neves. Should Brazil have got involved in Venezuela? Is the United States right to perhaps feel perplexed that it hasn't perhaps taken a stronger stand against the sort of unrest we've seen in Venezuela in the last year or so?
I think that Brazil should not get itself involved in Venezuela to the extent neither supporting nor against the government. So it is essentially something to Venezuelans to resolve. But at the same time, we should, consistent with our foreign policy throughout decades, we should voice our position if we find that Venezuela is disrupting or is violating international agreements of which we are part also. So it's a collective compromise, a collective commitment, and we should voice our position, not interfere in their internal situation.
And from your experience, then, how difficult is it to manage that relationship with the United States, this rather large, important, imposing neighbour over the border?
Brazil and the United States have very long, very comprehensive, diversified relations. Brazilian society is very alike. It's very, looks like American society. It's a country of immigrants, a country with an European contribution, with an African contribution, with Aboriginal contribution. So our society is marked by a great social mobility, which has been enhanced over the last few years. And in this respect, we have lots of characteristics in common with the U.S. But I could classify the Brazil-U.S. relationship as something marked by a benign indifference towards each other.
Well, sometimes it's rather worse than that, though, isn't it? If you think about differences over climate change or trade talks, or Brazil's often on a different side to the United States.
No, but I'm not concerned about that. Differences is healthy to the democratic debate. Democracy is based on dissension, actually. What I find is that the bureaucracies, both in Brazil and in the United States, and I think Kjeld has alluded to that, are still reasoning with Cold War premises, which are no longer valid. But on the other hand, one must take into consideration that when I mention East and West, I'm referring to geographic and cultural characteristics. I mean, Brazil speaks an European language. Our religion is an European religion. Our values are much more alike with those of the Western world rather than with China or Japan or the Asian world and such.
Even though economically you may coincide perhaps much more with, say, China and China's interests now.
Yeah, China is our main trading partner, but our export to the U.S. are much more diversified than to China. Yeah. And I would also like to mention something that I think is good characteristics of Brazil-U.S. relationship. We are very close to each other, but we are not willing to admit it in public. We look like young teenagers that are in love but are afraid of kissing in public.
Samantha Person, what do you make of this clandestine relationship then?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Luiz. That in 2009, China obviously overtook the US, become Brazil's biggest trading partner. But the US is still it's still the second biggest trading partner, and it's very important for technology transfers, for example, in the oil industry. And it's in Brazil's interest, I think, to improve its relationship with the US. And in some ways, it's a shame we had the spying scandal, because the visit in October last year would have been the first state visit by a Brazilian president since 1995. So if that had gone ahead, I think we would have realized how much progress had been made, really.
Well, I would like to comment on that. I think that President Dilma was right to suspend her visit to the U.S. because it would be a state visit, very important to enhance the relationship and to deepen the relationship between the two largest countries of the Western Hemisphere. But at the same time, this visit would be contaminated by the revelations of Snowden. So she was right in postponing the visit.
Paulo Wrobel?
No, I would just add that when China became, about 2 years ago, the largest trade partner of Brazil, the U.S. is the second. But it's interesting that the relationship, the commercial relationship between Brazil and China reminds very much old colony and colonial country relationship, meaning Brazil exports mainly commodities to China and imports manufactured goods. And it seems a bit odd that ideologically or politically Brazil is closer to China, but the sort of commercial relationship is much older style than the relationship that Brazil used to have with the United States, where the sort of goods that Brazil used to export and Brazil exports to the United States are much more diversified and much more manufactured products. than its exports to China. And then it's just a sort of oddness of this sort of relationship.
Before we move on, I just want to take one step back, in a way, into history, if I may. Kjeld Jakobsen, there was a time in 2008, after the crash, when you saw G20 meetings, big discussions about what should happen for the global financial architecture, something that Brazil got very involved in at the time. Do you still see Brazil behaving in the same way now, or is there perhaps a less willingness to get its hands dirty?
Now, there's a change, but it's not a change coming from the Brazilian side. The G20 meetings in 2008 and 2009 took very important decisions regarding how to face the financial crisis, which was a financial crisis at that time and became an economic crisis afterwards, like broader participation of Brazil and other southern countries in the IMF and so forth, certain measures to control financial flows and so forth and so forth and so forth. But all this is gone. Not because the Brazilian will, because the others' decisions or the power that the others have to change the agenda. What was decided regarding IMF, for instance, has not been accomplished so far.
But as a supplementary to that, slightly different tack, one of Brazil's foreign policy aims is reform of the UN Security Council and to achieve a permanent seat on the Security Council. Is that something that has also been sidelined? Is it something that Brazil is actually actively pushing for now?
That's, how can I say, that's a Brazilian demand since 1945. But there are certain moments, or even before, when they were... Okay. The League of the Nations, we also wanted a permanent seat there. However, there are moments where this debate becomes, how can I say, more present, and moments where it withdraws. And I think that's the case right now. So it's not on the world agenda, on the international agenda, but it will return, I'm sure.
We talked a little bit about China. One last thought, I'm not quite sure who would like to answer this. One last thought is, the interesting thing about Brazil, unlike, say, China or India, is it's in a very benign neighbourhood. The neighbours are very friendly. Samantha Person, does that, in a sense, make a difference? Can Brazil behave as a peacemaker in ways that other countries can't?
I think possibly so. It's been able to take that role without getting into too much trouble, I think, precisely because of that reason. But I think Lula, for example, he came across some problems in that role when he was in government. I don't know if you remember the 2009 Honduras affair, when Brazil's embassy was forced to take in the ousted president in Honduras, and Lula apparently found out about it 30 minutes before it happened and wasn't happy about it at all, because he had planned on taking a kind of very impartial role in the region, and he was forced into a very controversial situation, which also damaged the relationship with the US. So I think they've had an easy ride as such in Latin America so far. But I think that incident, for example, was a sign of what is to come for Brazil if it plans to take a bigger role on the global stage, because there will come situations that are similar where it will have to take sides, and that's going to be very difficult for Brazil, as Luiz said, which has traditionally always been very non-interventionist in its policy.
Paulo Wrobel, risks as well as responsibilities?
Yes, in a way, yes. Well, one problem is it's a benign neighborhood. Of course, China and India, they're more difficult neighborhoods. China now is in a conflict with Japan about some unimportant islands there. But again and again.
Depends who you are.
Yes. But anyway, but Brazil has 10 neighbors, which the sheer number of 10 neighbors creates a sort of constant need to be alert about any sorts of problems. You mentioned now Venezuela, for instance, is a big economic and political crisis in Venezuela. I think the Brazilian position is should be observing more than anything else. Argentina is in a difficult economic condition. Then it's benign, but there are risks, and there have been risks, and it has been historically not easy for Brazil to accommodate itself as the only Portuguese-speaking country, as the only monarchy amongst Spanish-speaking countries with different problems with frontiers. It took many years to resolve all these problems without resorting to war. Then it's a complex story that it looks quite easy and benign, but it's a bit more complex and complicated than that.
I want to talk about the neighbourhood a little bit more in a moment, but If you can imagine, we've reached the halfway point, so I'm just going to do a couple of ends and beginnings. You're listening to a special debate from Rio de Janeiro from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah. Do stay with me as we continue to discuss Brazil 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. We'll be back after the news. Welcome to this special debate from Rio de Janeiro from the BBC World Service. I'm Ritula Shah and I'm discussing Brazil 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. And joining me here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations are Luiz Augusto Castro e Neves, a former Brazilian ambassador and president of this august think tank, Kjeld Jakobsen, a foreign affairs spokesman for the governing PT or work, Paulo Wrobel, who's an economist from the BRICS Institute, a think tank here in Rio, and Samantha Person, a correspondent for the Financial Times in Brazil. It's a big year for Brazil, not least because of the World Cup. So let's return to football for just a moment. Brazil's traditional rival on the pitch is Argentina, but for many years the rivalry went well beyond football. As Brazil has emerged as an economic power, that relationship has changed too. Argentina is perhaps more willing to see Brazil as a partner and regional power. Ignacio de los Reyes reports from Buenos Aires.
The streets of Buenos Aires, full of European-style buildings, cafes, wide avenues, are a reflection of its glorious past. In the early 20th century, this country was as rich as some Western nations, competing with Brazil for the regional leadership. This rivalry was not always peaceful. Back in the 70s, the Brazilians even considered building a nuclear bomb to attack this city. But those days are gone. The fight is over, Argentina's economy is struggling, and now it's time for Brazil's momentum. I came to the Congress Palace in central Buenos Aires, an impressive Greco-Roman building with a giant dome. I asked Senator Ruperto Godoy, from the ruling Front for Victory party, if Argentina feels nostalgic about the time when Buenos Aires rivaled Brazilian cities as the cultural, political, and economic capital of South America.
No. I think we have overcome decades of military governments. When the armed forces in both nations saw the relationship between the two countries in terms of conflict and rivalry, even thinking about potential wars. That is the past now. We are well aware that our relevance in the world doesn't come as individual countries, but as a region, and our presidents know that.
These two old rivals learned they have to live together to succeed in a more competitive and global economy. Most of this cooperation is based on bilateral trade. They are the leaders of the Mercosur, an economic and political agreement for free trade and diplomatic support between South American nations. This is where much of the relationship between Brazil and Argentina is actually made. A car manufacturing plant in Buenos Aires. Hundreds of robots and workers are building the vehicles that will end up in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia or Sao Paulo in the coming months. Argentina will send nearly 1 million vehicles to Brazil only this year. It will also receive 500,000 from the Brazilian plants. This is a scheme of bilateral trade between the two countries that has been working for decades. I've come here to interview Enrique Alemany, the president of Ford in Argentina.
15 years ago, it was used to hear in Argentina, well, this is a Brazilian car, or in Brazil, this is an Argentinian car. Today, nobody talks about that. It's part of the region. And they are that about 10% of the Brazilian industry is Argentine-sourced products, and about 40% of the Argentine industry is Brazilian source product. Without having this association with Brazil, the probability of having a manufacturing automotive sector in the country was very limited. The level of integration is such that it's very difficult to foresee a model that you don't have both countries together.
This partnership is also shaping the cultural and human relations between the two countries. Old enemies that now share a common language. Portuguese has become mandatory in many Argentine schools, and every day more Argentines study at academies like Casa do Brasil or Brazilian House. Isaura Stragle is one of their teachers.
I think it's very important for them. There are many Brazilian companies that are starting to operate in Argentina, banks that are making business here, workers that come and go between the two countries. And for Argentine professionals, speaking the language makes it easy to find a job there.
This soap opera, Brazil Avenue, is smashing rating records on Argentine TV, and it's usually trending topic on social networks. Argentines used to follow the trends of European cinema, literature and fashion, but they are now addicted to the televised stories of ambitions and success in a Brazilian middle-class neighborhood. A sign of the changing times in this part of the world.
Ignacio de los Reyes reporting there. So, that relationship with Venezuela and the change in it, does it illustrate, Kjeld Jakobsen, Brazil as a regional power?
Well, Brazil is a regional power because the dimension of its territory, population, economy, and so forth. But there is this discussion about leadership or not. You can only become...
I said Argentina, and I said Venezuela, and I meant Argentina. Let me take that again. Does that change in the relationship between Brazil and Argentina illustrate Brazil as a global power? I'm getting all my words muddled up. Does that change in the relationship between Argentina and Brazil illustrate that Brazil has now become a truly regional power?
No, I don't think so. Brazil is a regional power because the dimension of its territory, population, economy, and so forth. And particularly during the last 2-3 decades, the relationship with Argentina has been quite good. It's a very important trade partner of Brazil. The trade between the two countries is something like $30 billion US, 20 billion in benefit of the Brazilian side. The last presidents have conveyed quite well, like President Sarney and Alfonsín, Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Menem had a lot of visions in common. And the relationship between the last two governments of Brazil, Lula and Dilma, with Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner, has also been quite good. So Brazil is Argentina is very important for Brazil as a partner. Of course, there are different points of view on certain issues, like the issue of the Security Council, for instance. But that's natural. We also have such a difference with Mexico, for example. And Mexico is quite far away compared to Argentina. So that's a normal discussion between governments and countries.
Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves, what's more important, do you think, this regional role, this role within organisations like the BRICS, or there is also the alphabet soup of organisations that seem to cover the Americas?
Well, we have a myriad of sort of a letter soup in terms of organizations and fora. Take the BRICS, for instance. The BRICS is a bunch of countries which have in common, the only thing that they do have in common is all of them want to have a louder voice in international affairs. They want to become, in our case, in the case of South Africa and India, we want to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We want to have a more important role in the IMF. We want to have more important roles in a number of fora. But there's not a sort of we have different agendas. Each BRIC country has a different international agenda, has a different foreign policy, have different priorities, different interests. So there's very few to be done in terms of cooperation in a multilateral sense within BRICS. We agree on a number of issues. We disagree on number of issues also, but as a matter of fact, the only bond that the BRICS countries have is the fact that they want to play a more important role in international affairs.
So Samantha Person, in that case, must the regional relationship always take primacy?
I think the relationship, for example, with Argentina is always going to be important because it's a huge country on its border. But I think in terms of the BRICS concept, which you have to remember was just a gimmick by Goldman Sachs to sell investments. and was a convenient one for Brazil, especially under Lula's government, as a form of propaganda for the country abroad. And I think the BRICS concept was useful for Brazil, but also it's very unuseful, as Luiz said. The countries don't have very much in common culturally, economically, and we saw that, for example, when Guido Monteca, the Brazilian finance minister, he announced very proudly that the BRICS were going to get together to choose a joint candidate for the World Bank, which never really happened. Also, the project to build a BRICS bank is not doing so well.
And then what of these organisations of the Americas? There's loads of them, and I have trouble, if I'm honest, remembering what they all do. Mercosur and there's lots more. Do they function? Are they important for Brazil? Are they an important place for Brazil to assert its economic strength, its view of the world?
I think Brazil has a tendency to pick and choose depending on its particular intention at that moment. For example, we're seeing talks about a trade deal with Europe between Mercosur. And in that sense, the bloc is of use to Brazil, but it's obviously having problems with Argentina in that sense. But I think perhaps one of the problems for Brazil is that it doesn't have a particular allegiance. It doesn't have continuity. For example, it hasn't stuck by Mercosur for years. It just uses it when it needs to. And obviously, that creates a lot of confusion outside Brazil. And I understand the US's point of view when they're not quite sure whether they can trust Brazil and what Brazil's intentions are. So in that way, it could be damaging, perhaps.
Can I add something on that? I think bilateral relations between Brazil and Argentina have changed substantially, but a generation ago, when both countries became turned back to civilian rule in the mid-1980s, and they resolved some problems, and they engaged in a sort of political and particularly economic with the formation of Mercosur in the early 1990s. But it's something that is already a generation old, and somehow Mercosur and the relations between Brazil and Argentina, in my view, really stagnated. They need a new agenda, they need new ideas, they need to move beyond what they have already achieved. Mercosur actually has never completed its way of becoming not even a common market. But they are responsible now for this sort of, even if trade is substantial and there is some integration in the automobile sector, but they definitively need some sort of new ideas and new agenda.
Kjeld Jakobsen, could this government or the next government inject those new ideas?
Of course, there are still a lot of things to be done regarding the Mercosur, like, for instance, not only free flow of capital, but also free flow of people and labor and so forth. But let me just give you a figure here. Between 1991 and 2012, the world trade grew around 400%. Brazilian trade with the world grew almost 800%. And Brazilian trade with Mercosur grew almost 1,000%. So that shows clearly in one of the aspects of international relations how important it is for Brazil, not only at certain moments, but as a permanent interest.
Can I be a bit controversial here? Should geography play its part? Is Brazil simply too isolated from the rest of the world to really matter, can only really matter in the context of this continent in South America?
I think one important point here is actually Brazil's geography matters in terms that Brazil is so big, and it's actually one of, I take your point that it's increased its trade with the rest of the world, but Brazil is actually one of the most closed economies in the world when you look at imports as a percentage of GDP, and I think that's played a big role in its kind of island mentality. So in that way, Brazil has the luxury, perhaps, of not having the foreign policy that some of its neighbours have to have.
Paulo Wrobel?
I think big countries tend to be more introvert. I think it's a question of geography, it's a question of dimension, it's a question of culture, it's a question of historical formation, and Brazil is one of the big countries. Then yes, Brazil is introvert. I think Brazil, as was already mentioned, foreign affairs and foreign issues are not very important for Brazil, are not very popular, are not, for instance, there will be election now. By the end of the year, foreign policy will not be part of the discussion about the presidential elections. Then, sorry, then it is the case that big countries tend to be introverted, and Brazil is quite introverted.
Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves.
Yes, I would like simply to qualify something that has been said by Kjeld about the international trade. Brazil's slice of the global trade has always been between 1.3 and 1.9%. That since 1945. So we, in certain years when commodities prices were up, we increased our slice of the global trade. Now we are around 1.3%. So it hasn't changed much in terms of our relative importance in international trade, despite the fact that Brazil is now the 7th world economy and a much more diversified economy. As far as Mercosur is concerned, one should bear in mind that before Mercosur, and not considering Venezuela, which was not a part of Mercosur at the time, we had with Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, 11% of our foreign trade was with those three countries. After that, in the 90s and in the early 20s, that proportion grew to 18 or 19%, but then it came back again to the extent that the Argentine economy was facing a huge crisis. And nowadays we are around, again, 11, 12% of our foreign trade with those three countries.
But you've all been terribly polite. Kjeld Jakobsen, given the size of Brazil, given the size of its economy, its power, its strength, why isn't it the regional leader? Why can't you declare yourselves the regional leader? Should it be the regional leader?
Well, first of all, to become a leader, you need to have the acceptance of the others to recognize you as the leader. And I think that in a multilateral system, this issue of leadership is something that you should, how can I say, put as something relative, like the U.S. itself. Like the U.S. itself. Farid Zakaria, an American professor, he said, well, the discussion is not about the decline or not of the U.S. The discussion is about the rise of others. And I think that's a phenomenon that we are watching today. And we are under a process of geopolitical reaccommodation, which is not finished yet.
Well, in that same context, then, there are plenty of people talking about the traditional organisations, the architecture we've known since the Second World War of the UN, the G7, the G8, whatever, of it no longer being relevant or it no longer working. But we have seen in the past Brazil, over something like, say, climate change, cooperate quite closely with India and China, these kind of informal banding together of groups that suddenly, on a particular issue, have something in common. Is that what we're going to see much more in the future? Samantha Person.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Brazil perhaps doesn't want to be the boss of Latin America, partly because, as we said before, Brazilians associate themselves much more with Americans. They don't really think they have much in common with Latin Americans. They don't consider themselves Latin Americans. So I think that may be a reason why they think it's not worth the effort and the risk in Latin America, and they'd rather be a kind of informal head of the emerging markets. And we've seen that with Manteiga, the finance minister. He's often positioned himself as the leader of the BRICS or the leader of this South-South group that is emerging. And I think that's much more interesting to Brazil and perhaps makes sense if you look at the future of where the global economy is going as well.
Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves.
No, regarding the point that we don't see ourselves as Latin Americans, I wouldn't be that radical, but as a matter of fact, Latin America, the concept of Latin America is a foreign concept for us. It has been invented by the French, by Catholic philosophers in the 19th century, and it has been adopted by Napoleon III as a means to justify or help his intervention in Mexico. What has to be considered is the fact that we have a Hispanic America and a Portuguese America with histories which are totally different. We were a monarchy in the 19th century. We did not divide ourselves in several republics as the Hispanics have done. And so our agenda tended to be totally different from the rest of Latin America. To a certain extent, we did not pay attention to them. They were in our backyard and we were in their backyard. With the exception of Argentina, we had a meaningful relationship throughout the years. We always saw ourselves as closer to the U.S., given that our society, the social forms of organizations in Brazil are much more comparable to the U.S. society rather than to Hispanic America. Therefore, we do have it does have a point in Brazil viewing itself as a third category within the Americas: an Anglo-America, United States and Canada, a Hispanic America, and a Portuguese America.
And on that rather lovely thought, I'm going to open up the floor for some questions. There is a microphone, a roving microphone. Please don't be shy. You've heard me mangle my words, so I'm sure you'll be better. If you can say your name and however you'd like to be described, and then ask your question.
Peter Knight from the Fernand Braudel Institute of World Economy. There were a couple of things I didn't notice being said. One of them was the relationship in investment between Brazil and China. The trade is balanced in numerical terms, but not in the quality of the trade. But investment is very unbalanced. And we might say China practices some of the techniques that Brazil used to practice. The other thing is the interest of the BRICS. It wasn't mentioned that none of them are part of the economic blocs. Let's say not the North American Free Trade Association, the European Common Market, or even the East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, if you want to say. So I wonder if the speakers could address those issues.
Samantha Person, an unequal relationship in terms of investment between Brazil and China. And does it matter that the BRICS are, in a sense, a little organisation amongst themselves? They're not part of some of these other bigger blocs.
In terms of the BRICS, I don't think it does matter, because I think perhaps the reason the BRICS is so important to the countries that are the member of the BRICS is because they feel that the other options available to them just are not sufficient for their needs. And in terms of China and Brazil, I think you're right, it is a very unequal relationship. It's also a very difficult relationship. I don't know if you've ever seen Chinese and Brazilian people trying to do business together. It just doesn't work. There's the huge language barrier. There's the time difference for a start, which makes a big difference. And I think it's very difficult for Brazilians to go into China to do business there. The Chinese are coming here. They're starting banks as well as commodity operations. But it's extremely difficult for Brazilians to do the same in China.
Paulo Wrobel from the BRICS Institute.
In terms of investment, I mean, there is a recent flow of investment from China in Brazil, particularly in the state of Rio de Janeiro, particularly in the oil and gas and electricity sectors. And this is welcome, because it's the diversification of foreign investment in these sectors, which are quite concentrated. And there is more. There is interest in China in investing more in Brazil, because China is a big investor outside China in these particular areas. China is looking for oil and gas and minerals and natural resources, and China has invested a lot in in Latin America, other countries in Latin America, and particularly in Africa. In terms of how the BRICS countries are not part of big economic blocs, I think it's precisely because they are not part of economic blocs that they have some independence and some leeway to develop as they wish the sort of relationships, bilateral and multilateral relations that they wish. But of course, they don't have a lot of things in common economically. They are countries, as I said, China and Brazil, trade and investment is very favorable to China, for instance.
Luiz, Augusto, Castro de Neves.
Well, when I was living in China, the stock of Brazilian investment in China was bigger than the stock of Chinese investment in Brazil at the time. We had a number of industries established in China because they were there after a lower tax burden, a better infrastructure, and other features that made it much more interesting to become more competitive in China. And I remember at the time when President Lula visited China in 2008, I accompanied him in a meeting with President Hu Jintao, and he complained about the fact that we were investing in China, creating jobs in China, and the Chinese were very reluctant to invest in Brazil. They began investing in Brazil, at first mainly regarding the issue of assurances of supply, because they badly need what we produce in terms of commodities, in terms of foodstuff. And then now they are shifting their investment in Brazil. They are trying to produce in Brazil durable goods, cars, and so their presence is indeed increasing in Brazil, as in many other countries in the world. It does reflect the fact that China is now the second biggest economy in the world. If sometimes we are concerned, and there are some people in Brazil that are concerned about the Chinese invasion, one could see the Chinese invasion as a response to our demands that they should invest in Brazil, they should come to Brazil, they should complement much more their productive chains in Brazil.
Kjeld Jakobsen?
No, just a short comment, agreeing with what the ambassador said, that if you compare the Chinese investments in Brazil and other Latin American countries, the quality of our investments that we are getting are superior, because in other countries they are just looking for mining and commodities. So I think it's better for us.
Another question. Shall I look at this side of the room? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Tatiana. I'm from the Brazilian Center for International Relations. I'd like just to put I'd like to work on things that have been said here and put them a little bit on perspective, since, as the host said in the beginning of this program, we are now in election year, so I do believe we have to have careful thoughts on what we're going to say about our government. First of all, I think Brazil is passing through a transition on a very traditional and elitist approach to foreign relations, to a more democratic approach to foreign relations, as far as we are now introducing new actors in the debate, and we are now discussing a broader agenda that includes not only high politics issues, but also low politics issues. And I think it has to do with our process of globalization, and the fact that in a globalized world, inequalities inside countries and outside countries, they do go along together. And the funny thing is that...
do you have a question? Sorry, I need a question. I don't want a speech.
Yeah, I want to comment on that, especially on Kjeld. Because don't you think globalization and this mixed perspective of inequality inside and out are a very important issue to think about, and a reason why our population, it doesn't matter if poor or middle class or rich, are now getting in touch with foreign policy issues.
I'm not sure what the question was, but if anyone would like to comment.
No, I think I understood it quite well. I think that during the last 3 or 4 elections, I think there is a growing interest, despite that the majority of people are not caring about this debate. They are more concerned about our local issues. But it's also visible that due to the broad agenda of international items, that how can I say, international relations are not just related to state relations. So civil society is also becoming more and more included when we talk about climate change, when we talk about labor, when we talk about, economic integration, social integration, and so forth. There is even a demand of a group of civil society organizations in Brazil, and already in conversations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to create a Foreign Affairs Council with participation of the civil society as a consultative forum with the government.
Now, we're actually quite short of time, and I'm conscious it's very warm in this room. What I'd like to do is, may I take 2 questions, and if I can get a brief response from all of you. So this gentleman here, and I think there was a couple down here. I'll take 3. So.
Good morning. My name is Rafael Almeida. I'm with the University Federal Fluminense. And my question is quite simple, but first I'd like to thank the BBC and CEBRI and especially BRICS Policy Center for opening the doors and putting this debate to the table. My question is very simple, is politically, is Brazil losing a momentum? So it would be basically a yes or no question. Thank you very much.
And if we could take a couple of questions from down here at the front.
Good morning. My name is Pedro. I'm from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I'd like to ask for you to comment on the relations between Brazil and Africa. To this moment in the debate, Africa was mentioned one time by Paulo Wrobel. And I'd like to see a little more about the relations we have had with the Portuguese-speaking countries and the other countries.
Any more? One more? I can take one more at the back there.
Morning. My name is Rodrigo Coutinho. I'm a recent graduate from NYU Global Affairs. My question is quite the opposite of his. Actually, my question is, isn't Brazil gaining momentum? Because, in fact, when you look at the, numbers and, well, one thing I'd like to mention is, since Barão do Rio Branco, the tradition of Brazilian foreign policy has been of good neighbors. So one thing that has been commented is if we should interfere in Venezuela affairs or not. I don't think we ever done that, and I don't believe Brazil would do that. But actually, in terms of economic, we're gaining momentum. The Olympics and the World Cup are actually going to attract investments and visibility. In terms of politics, we're quite gaining momentum. And in discussions of clean energy, for example, there is no discussions on clean energy without considering Brazil or many other issues, biodiversity, for example. So that's my point, my question.
Okay, well, that's rather helpful. Let's split those into two then, if we may. Let's begin actually with that. Is Brazil losing or gaining momentum? Samantha Person.
To be very concise, I think it's visibly losing momentum in terms of foreign policy, but I think its foreign policy is perhaps going in a better direction than in the past.
Luiz, Augusto, Castro, Neves.
Yes, well, I would agree with Samantha. We have a number of choices to make. And there's a saying in Brazil that we always choose the correct alternative, but only after having tried all the others. That's the point. We are slow in our reaction, in responding to the challenges before us. Very often we go after chimeras, but we always fall back in the right track. And as Samantha has pointed out, we are moving towards a more appropriate foreign policy, and we are qualifying both the idea that we were gaining an extraordinary momentum a few years ago, that we are losing this momentum. I think the truth is in between.
Paulo Wrobel?
I think I agree that we are losing momentum in terms of both foreign policy and economics as well. And, together, is making Brazil somehow a less relevant actor than it should be or could be.
Well, I will disagree with the three of you, sorry. I think we are gaining momentum despite the difficult moments that the world is going through. But we managed to elect the Director General of the WTO recently. We elected Director General of the FAO. We elected a representative for the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. So if we were losing momentum, that would probably not have happened. So I think we are in a continuation of President Lula's policy at the present, but the world is different than it was during his mandate. And just to answer your your question.
No, well, can I come to that now?
Okay, sorry. Okay, and I will wait.
So let's just raise the question of Africa then, Brazil and Africa. big investment by Brazil in Africa, an expansion of embassies and so on. What's the relationship like? What should we be thinking about?
They also increase, so we have stronger political relations with more embassies, good relationships with several countries that we didn't used to have that before. The economic presence of Brazil in Africa is also growing, and the development cooperation of Brazil in Africa is also very present in several areas.
Paulo Wrobel?
Yes, it is improving in many respects. I mean, the relationship with South Africa now, for instance, there are two forums, the BRICS and also the IBAS, the India, Brazil, South Africa, which is a trilateral relationship. And also Brazil has trying to cooperate in terms of, for instance, food production, with which Brazil has good technology, and other areas that is a very diverse. Of course, Africa is a very diverse continent, and Africa, some parts of Africa are growing very much, are expanding very much in sectors such as oil and gas and minerals. Then Brazil perhaps could play an even more active role in this area, even with more private investment in these opportunities.
Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves.
I think that our presence in Africa is important and not very well publicized. We have a very good presence in Mozambique, for instance, where there's a team of Embrapa in a project financed by Japan, which is helping the Mozambicans to use their savanna, which looks like very much like our cerrado, and planting not only to produce foodstuff, but also to produce fuel, sugarcane fuel, ethanol from sugarcane. We have here Dr. Fenn, who's present here, is one of the best specialists in Brazil's presence in Africa. He himself lived a number of years in Angola, helping to organize the Angolan government, mainly the economic team after the Civil War. And so we do have an important presence in Africa, but a sort of a low-profile presence, despite the fact that we are always trying to sell the idea that Brazil and Africa have very close relationships. As a matter of fact, most of Africa have closer relationships with European Union, with the former colonial powers, for historical reasons. Perhaps the only exception, and it is good that it is so, is the Portuguese-speaking Africa, because the colonial power was very tiny and powerless. So Brazil did occupy a space, or is trying to occupy a space, which is a very positive idea.
Samantha Person, how would you view the relationship with Africa?
I think it's a new relationship, but a potentially very important relationship. And I think both Lula and Dilma have worked very hard to improve that relationship. Last year, we saw Brazil cancelling or restructuring, I think, $900 million of African debt, which was a very important step. But it's also important to say that it's also a very difficult relationship. I don't know if you're aware, Vale, the Brazilian miner, Brazil's second biggest company, is having huge problems in Guinea at the moment over corruption scandal, which threatens to kind of obscure the company's performance at the moment. So I think that's a reminder that it's not going to be easy sailing. It's going to be a difficult relationship, but one that's worth having.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to end it there, but because I love you all so much, I'm going to say goodbye twice. So bear with me for just another minute or so. That's it then from this special edition of The World Tonight from the Brazilian Center for International Relations in Rio de Janeiro. I'm Ritula Shah. Thank you very much to all our guests, Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves, Kjeld Jakobsen, Paulo Wrobel and Samantha Person. Thank you all for listening and joining in. Good night. That's it from this special debate from the BBC World Service, when we've been discussing Brazil 2014, taking its place as a global power or retreating from the world stage. Thanks to all our guests, Luiz Augusto Castro de Neves, Kjeld Jakobsen, Paulo Wrobel and Samantha Person. I'm Ritula Shah. Thanks for listening.